the glitzy gala and a growing shadow. The ballrooms of the Ambassador Hotel shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, a symphony of champagne flutes clinking and a jazz band weaving a tapestry of smooth, smoky notes. Sequins glittered, diamonds flashed, and the air thrummed with the intoxicating hum of Hollywood's elite. Starlets in silk gowns mingled with studio moguls in tailored tuxedos, their laughter echoing off the gilded ceilings. Waiters drifted through the throng, trays laden with miniature quiches and caviar blinis. Dean Martin, ever the picture of effortless cool, sauntered in, a faint smile playing on his lips. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, nodding to familiar faces, exchanging quick, witty remarks. A tumbler of amber liquid soon found its way into his hand, and he leaned against a marble pillar, observing the spectacle with a detached amusement that belied his sharp, observant eyes. He saw Leo Goldberg, perched like a vulture on a plush banquette, dissecting the room with an almost surgical precision, his dry chuckle occasionally cutting through the general din. The atmosphere shifted subtly as Victor Vance made his entrance. He didn't walk, he commanded the space, a dark, imposing figure whose very presence seemed to suck the warmth from the room. His tailored suit looked less like clothing and more like armour. Conversations nearest him faltered, then resumed in hushed tones. Victor's gaze swept the room, not with curiosity, but with an almost proprietorial air, as if every star, every diamond, every drop of champagne existed solely for his pleasure. Dean watched as Victor's eyes snagged on Eleanor Vance, who stood by a potted palm, a glass of untouched sparkling water clutched in her hand, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if trying to disappear into the verdant foliage. Her usually sharp mind, Dean knew, was currently battling a surge of social anxiety, her gaze darting nervously around the opulent room. Victor moved with predatory slowness, a shark circling its prey. He stopped before Eleanor, his massive frame eclipsing her delicate figure. His voice, initially a low growl audible only to her, cut through the general merriment. Dean, despite the distance, felt a prickle of unease. He saw Eleanor flinch, her eyes widening, her grip tightening on her glass. "Eleanor, what in God's name were you thinking?" Victor's voice, though still relatively low, had an edge that made heads subtly turn. "That piece you submitted for the script review, it was an absolute disaster, a public embarrassment. Do you have any idea how much my reputation is tied to your incompetence?" Eleanor's face paled, her lips trembling as she tried to form a response. Her gaze dropped to the polished floor, her usual quiet resilience crumbling under the weight of his public censure. I thought it followed the brief, Victor," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Victor scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. The brief? The brief was, 'Don't make me look like a fool, Eleanor,' and you failed spectacularly. Honestly, sometimes I wonder if you're even capable of stringing two coherent thoughts together. Perhaps you're better suited to staying home, don't you think?" His voice had risen now, cutting through the jazz music, drawing the attention of those nearby. A hushed silence began to spread outwards from their small tense tableau. Leo Goldberg, from his vantage point, merely raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Dean, however, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The easy smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a steely glint in his eyes. A witness to cruelty. Dean leaned back in the plush booth, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his fingers, a wry smile playing on his lips as Leo recounted a particularly outrageous studio anecdote. The clinking of glasses and a low hum of conversation formed the backdrop to their corner of the Trocadero. Dean was just about to deliver a perfectly timed punchline when his gaze drifted, snagging on a familiar, unpleasant tableau across the room. Victor Vance, a crimson flush spreading from his neck to his bald pate, was leaning into Eleanor, his wife, his voice a low, venomous hiss. Eleanor, usually a study in muted pastels, was practically shrinking into the banquette, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the pristine white tablecloth as if hoping it would swallow her whole. Her fingers, usually so delicate, were knotted tightly in her lap, the knuckles stark white. A tremor ran through her, subtle but unmistakable, as Victor's voice gained an edge of sharp, metallic anger. Dean tried to refocus on Leo, to laugh at the tale of a chimpanzee escaping a set and wreaking havoc in the commissary, but his attention was a recalcitrant dog, straining on its leash towards the escalating drama. Oh. And then he says, "You call that acting, you overgrown baboon?" Leo was roaring with laughter, oblivious. But Dean heard Victor's next words, cutting through the ambient noise like a razor. "Utterly useless, Eleanor. Can't you even manage to order a decent bottle without making a fool of me?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor flinched. Her eyes, when they finally flickered up, were wide with a raw, unprotected fear that tightened something in Dean's gut. He saw the sheen of unshed tears, the desperate plea in her gaze. A familiar conflict ignited within Dean. It wasn't his fight, Thormint. He'd learned long ago that interfering in domestic squabbles, especially with men like Vance, was a fool's errand. It invited trouble, unwelcome scrutiny, and usually accomplished nothing. Yet, the image of Eleanor's face, etched with such profound misery, gnawed at him. Vance was a predator, always had been, and Eleanor, with her quiet intelligence and even quieter demeanour, was easy prey. To stand by, to simply watch this slow public torture, it felt less like discretion and more like complicity. The easy charm Dean usually wore began to feel like a flimsy disguise, barely concealing a growing indignation. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke suddenly tasting acrid and wrong. The breaking point. The clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation that usually filled the commissary had dwindled to a tense silence. Victor Vance, a man whose presence was as imposing as his reputation, stood over Eleanor, his voice a low growl that rapidly escalated. "Are you deaf, woman? I asked a simple question. This report is a travesty, a goddamn insult to my intelligence." Eleanor, her shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink into the polished linoleum, clutched a sheaf of papers to her chest. Her eyes, usually obscured by thick-rimmed glasses, widened, shimmering with unshed tears. A single tear traced a path down her cheek as Victor's voice reached a fever pitch, echoing off the high ceilings. "Incompetence! I don't pay you to make me look like a fool." Dean, who had been idly stirring his coffee at a nearby table, felt the familiar prickle of irritation. He'd seen this tableau countless times. Victor, the vulture, tearing into some hapless assistant, a public display of dominance. Usually Dean would offer a wry comment to a companion, a rolling of the eyes, a silent dismissal. It was Hollywood after all, sharks ate smaller fish. But something about the way Eleanor's thin shoulders trembled, the stark humiliation etched on her face, struck a different chord. It wasn't just a bad day. It was a slow, deliberate demolition of a human being. A tightness bloomed in Dean's chest. The easy charm, the indifferent shrug he usually wore like a second skin, felt suddenly too heavy, too flimsy. He saw not just Eleanor, but every quiet soul who'd ever been crushed under the heel of someone bigger, louder, more powerful. The casual cruelty of it all, the absolute lack of grace, curdled in his stomach. His gaze, usually so full of easy amusement, sharpened, focusing on Victor's puffed-up chest, the veins throbbing in his neck. A quiet rage began to simmer beneath Dean's placid exterior. He had always avoided direct confrontation, preferring to diffuse with wit or simply sidestep the ugliness of the world. But this wasn't about avoiding trouble. It was about something far more fundamental. It was about right and wrong. He felt a sudden, undeniable urge to protect, to interpose himself between this predator and his prey. The internal debate, brief and brutal, was over. The indifference melted away, replaced by a steely resolve he rarely showed. With a soft scraping of his chair, Dean pushed back from the table. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes now fixed on the scene unfolding. He took a single deliberate step towards Victor and Eleanor, a decision solidified, a line crossed. A wall of calm. Dean's smile, usually a permanent fixture, thinned to a mere shadow as he watched Victor Vance's sneering face loom over Eleanor. The low murmur of the party, the clinking of glasses, the soft jazz trailing from the bandstand, it all seemed to recede, leaving only the sharp edge of Victor's condescending tone. Dean felt a familiar tension coil in his gut, a quiet fury that few ever witnessed. He'd seen bullies before, plenty of them, but something about Victor's gleeful cruelty, especially directed at someone as visibly distressed as Eleanor, grated against a deeply held conviction within him. This wasn't just a bad joke, it was a public execution of spirit. He set down his half-finished drink on a passing tray, the ice clinking a final, almost mournful sound. His movements were fluid, unhurried, yet imbued with a distinct purpose. He didn't rush, didn't draw attention with a sudden burst of speed. Instead, he simply moved, a steady, unyielding presence navigating the throng of glittering gowns and tailored suits. Heads turned, conversations faltered, not yet understanding the shift in the room's atmosphere, but sensing a change in the current. Victor was still holding court, his voice a low growl of derision. Eleanor's shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. Just as Victor leaned in, ready for another verbal thrust, Dean arrived. He didn't speak, didn't make a grand gesture. He simply stepped, placing himself squarely between Victor and Eleanor. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of body, yet the effect was immediate and profound. The jazz band, mid-riff, faltered. A pianist hit a sour note, then fell silent. Conversations died one by one like candles extinguishing in a sudden draft. The clinking of ice, the rustle of silk, the soft hum of the air conditioning, everything ceased. A palpable hush descended, thick and expectant, pressing in on the small tableau. All eyes, it seemed, were now fixed on Dean's broad shoulders, his calm, unreadable profile. Victor, mid-sentence, stumbled over his words. He turned, his face a mask of annoyance quickly contorting into genuine surprise, then outrage. His eyes, usually glittering with malice, widened slightly as they met Dean's. Dean's expression remained perfectly neutral, a wall of calm against Victor's rising storm. There was no challenge in Dean's eyes, no overt aggression, just an absolute unwavering presence. The message was clear, unspoken. This stops now. Leo Goldberg, observing from a shadowed corner, felt a prickle of something akin to awe. Dean, usually the master of deflection, had just walked directly into the eye of the hurricane, and for once his face held no trace of his usual easy charm. This was something else entirely. The stare down. The clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation died an abrupt, unsettling death. Victor Vance, his face a mottled crimson, jabbed a finger inches from the cowering intern's nose. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? You incompetent fool!" His voice, usually a booming instrument of charm, was now a raw, exposed nerve vibrating with barely contained fury. The young woman, Eleanor, shrank further into herself, her eyes wide with unshed tears. Leo Goldberg, from his vantage point by the bar, took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze flickering between the aggressor and his victim. Then a new voice cut through the charged silence, calm and even, yet resonating with an unexpected steel. "Vic, is there a problem here?" Victor spun around, his rage momentarily diverted. Dean Martin stood a few feet away, a half smile playing on his lips, though his eyes held no amusement. He had moved with an unhurried grace that belied the suddenness of his intervention. Victor's glare, usually enough to wither lesser men, met Dean's steady, unflinching stare. It was a silent challenge, two immovable forces poised on the brink of collision. The air crackled with an almost tangible tension, a dangerous static that held the entire room captive. Nobody dared to breathe too deeply. "A problem?" Victor's laugh was a harsh bark. "This imbecile just ruined the entire presentation. And you, Dean, what exactly do you think you're doing interrupting me?" Dean's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He took a single deliberate step forward, positioning himself squarely between Victor and the trembling Eleanor. His voice, though still quiet, dropped to a tone that left no room for doubt. "That's enough, Vic. Leave them alone." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The crowd, a collection of Hollywood's most jaded and influential, held its collective breath. This wasn't a playful jab or a staged confrontation. This was real, raw, and entirely unexpected. Victor Vance, who routinely carved up careers and reputations with casual cruelty, was being told to stand down by Dean Martin, the laid-back crooner. Leo Goldberg lowered his glass, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his shrewd eyes. Victor's mouth opened, then closed. He looked from Dean's unyielding gaze to the silent, expectant faces of the onlookers. His anger, so potent moments before, seemed to deflate, replaced by a bewildered shock. He was unaccustomed to defiance, utterly unprepared for someone to genuinely stand in his way. Dean just watched him, his expression unchanging, a quiet strength radiating from him that seemed to push Victor back without a single physical touch. The standoff stretched, taut and perilous until, with a frustrated huff, Victor finally turned away, muttering curses under his breath. The spell was broken, but the silence that followed was different now, filled with a newfound respect. The retreat of the vulture. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Victor's jaw worked, a muscle twitching in his temple. He opened his mouth, a grand pronouncement clearly forming, but the words seemed to catch in his throat, dissolving into a guttural sound. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, darted from Dean's unyielding stare to the sour, hushed faces of the onlookers, then back to Dean. He expected flinching, a flicker of fear, but found only a quiet resolve that seemed to absorb his venomous intent. Dean stood there, hands casually tucked into his pockets, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt to his head. He wasn't smiling, nor was he frowning. His expression was simply present, unmoved. It was the calm before a storm that inexplicably refused to break. Victor, accustomed to immediate submission, found himself adrift in this unfamiliar current. He tried again, a cutting retort about Dean's career trajectory, or perhaps his recent choices, but the carefully honed barbs felt dull, pointless. The air itself seemed to resist his malice. A bead of sweat trickled down Victor's temple, a stark contrast to Dean's cool composure. The vulture's face, usually flushed with indignation, began to pale. His anger, so readily ignited, sputtered and died, replaced by a baffled bewilderment. He didn't know how to fight this. There was no leverage, no weakness to exploit in Dean's quiet strength. It was like trying to punch smoke. Eleanor, trembling beside him, watched with wide, disbelieving eyes, a fragile hope blossoming within her. Leo, a detached observer by nature, felt a rare spark of admiration for Dean's effortless defiance. Finally, Victor gave a frustrated, inarticulate growl. He spun on his heel, the movement jerky and uncoordinated. "This isn't over, Martin," he muttered, his voice lacking its usual thunder, sounding instead like a petulant child. He stalked away, a defeated shadow retreating from the unexpected light. The crowd, holding its collective breath, slowly exhaled. A soft murmur rippled through the room like the first stirrings of a forest after a sudden gust of wind. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation gradually resumed, but the undercurrent of shock and awe remained, a testament to the quiet battle that had just been won, a quiet thank you. The oppressive silence in the room finally fractured, but Eleanor didn't hear the murmurs that followed. Her world had narrowed to Dean, standing tall and utterly unruffled before her. The tears that had welled in her eyes, hot and stinging moments before, now flowed freely, a deluge of relief washing over the terror that had gripped her. She tried to speak, to form words of thanks, but her throat was tight, choked with a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical ache. Her breath hitched, a small ragged sound lost in the sudden flurry of hushed conversations and averted gazes. Dean, sensing her distress, offered a small reassuring nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, no sweeping bow or dramatic pronouncement, just a subtle dip of his head, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. His eyes, usually dancing with mischief, held a steady, empathetic light. It was a silent promise that the storm had passed, that she was safe. The corner of his mouth twitched, a hint of his usual easy smile, but it was softer, gentler than she had ever seen it. He then turned, his movements fluid and unhurried. He didn't linger, didn't milk the moment for applause or recognition. With a casualness that belied the dramatic confrontation he had just navigated, he ambled back towards his friends, a small cluster of laughter and clinking glasses. As he rejoined them, a quip already forming on his lips, the relaxed persona he habitually wore settled back over him like a perfectly tailored suit. He picked up his drink, leaned back against the bar, and was, to all outward appearances, simply Dean Martin, enjoying a night out. Eleanor watched him go, a tremor running through her. The oppressive weight that had settled on her chest for so long began to lift, replaced by a strange lightness. The fear was still a faint echo, but it was overshadowed by a new exhilarating sensation. Hope. The man who had just stood between her and public humiliation, who had risked his own standing for a stranger, was not the charming, carefree entertainer she had always perceived. He was something more, something deeper, stronger, and infinitely more courageous. Her perception of him, once framed by the magazine covers and movie screens, had shattered and reformed, revealing an unexpected hero beneath the smooth facade. The image of his unflinching stance, the quiet conviction in his eyes, etched itself into her memory, a beacon in the darkness. She knew, with a certainty that hummed through her veins, that she would never look at Dean Martin the same way again. The quiet strength she had witnessed was a revelation, and it had changed everything. Whispers and new perceptions. The clinking of ice and the murmur of polite conversation had dissolved into a hushed collective intake of breath. A ripple of astonishment spread through the room, punctuated by the rustle of silk and the soft scuff of shoes as guests subtly shifted, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and bewildered admiration. Dean Martin, usually the epitome of effortless charm and smooth patter, now stood like a sentinel, his shoulders squared, an uncharacteristic stillness about him that was far more imposing than any bluster. The air crackled with the residual tension of a downed power line. Leo Goldberg, a connoisseur of human drama, watched from the periphery, a half-empty glass of amber liquid forgotten in his hand. He'd seen his share of manufactured bravado and carefully staged theatrics in this town, but this was different. This was raw, unscripted. Dean, the man whose primary concern seemed to be the next martini and a good laugh, had just faced down one of Hollywood's most notorious bullies with a quiet resolve that had silenced an entire ballroom. Leo saw the flicker in Dean's eyes, not fear, but a steely determination he hadn't known the crooner possessed. It was a new shade to the familiar portrait, a depth he'd dismissed as non-existent. "Did you see that?" whispered a starlet, her voice barely audible, to a producer whose jaw was still slightly ajar. "He just stood there." "Against him," another guest added, referring to the now retreating bully, whose bluster had evaporated like mist in a desert sun. "I thought for sure it was going to turn ugly. Dean always seemed so easygoing." Easygoing, Leo mused, was the last word he'd use now. Dean was still standing exactly where he'd been, a silent guardian, a silent promise that the ugliness wouldn't resurface. He wasn't preening, wasn't accepting accolades. He merely waited, a quiet strength radiating from him. The incident wasn't just a spectacle, it was a revelation. Dean Martin wasn't just a singer, a comedian, a handsome face. He was a man with an inner compass that pointed true, a man who wouldn't tolerate injustice, and even if it meant risking his own carefully curated image. The smooth veneer had cracked, and beneath it, Leo saw not weakness, but an unexpected, formidable core. The whispers around the room were no longer about the scandal itself, but about the man who had dared to end it. Dean had transformed, in one electrifying moment, from a charming entertainer into something far more substantial, a hero. Beyond the crooner's smile, the aftershocks of Dean's intervention rippled through the industry, not with the explosive force of a scandal, but with a quiet, persistent hum of re-evaluation. No longer was he merely the languid crooner, the martini-swilling charmer whose biggest gambles involved a poker hand or a perfectly timed quip. The incident, whispered about in hushed tones in dimly lit booths and over clinking ice at exclusive parties, had etched a new dimension onto his public persona. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the steel beneath the velvet. Dean, of all people, a screenwriter notorious for his cynicism, mused to a fellow scribe over espresso, "I always thought he was all surface. Turns out he's got more spine than a porcupine in a tuxedo." The other man nodded, a thoughtful expression replacing his usual jaded smirk. "He didn't even break a sweat, just stepped in, like it was the most natural thing in the world to stare down a raging bull." Producers who once dismissed his casual demeanour as indifference now saw it as a calculated detachment, a sign of inner strength. Actresses who'd previously swooned over his looks now spoke of his quiet resolve with a newfound respect, a deeper admiration that transcended mere attraction. "He didn't do it for applause, you know," Angie, a starlet known for her sharp observations, told her publicist. "He did it because it was wrong. That's a rare thing in this town, honey. A very rare thing." The enduring understanding was that beneath the impeccably tailored suits and the seemingly effortless cool resided a man who possessed an unshakable moral compass. He wouldn't tolerate injustice, not when he saw it with his own eyes. The incident had burned away any lingering perception of him as simply an entertainer, a cog in the Hollywood machine. He was now undeniably a man of principles, a quiet sentinel against the venality that often festered in the shadows of fame. His easy smile, once interpreted as a sign of nonchalance, now carried a subtle weight, a hint of the unwavering conviction that lay beneath. It was a smile that could disarm, yes, but also one that suggested a man who knew precisely where he stood and wouldn't be swayed. Dean Martin, the crooner, the comedian, the Rat Pack fixture, had cemented his legacy not just as a prodigious talent, but as a man of courage and integrity. He was, in the truest sense, a hero, his unexpected act of defiance echoing long after the applause had faded.